Welcome back to the final episode of today's Crosstalks. For viewers tuning in for the first time, this show is a collaboration between the Royal Institute of Technology, KTH, and Stockholm University. We air live from KTH, and towards the end of this session, you will have a chance to ask our guests your questions on the air by calling us on our Skype address, Crosstalks TV. You can also discuss the show and talk to us on Twitter, where our handle is Crosstalks TV and our hashtag is Crosstalks. In many of our earlier Crosstalks episodes, discussions have suggested very dark futures for humanity. But not everything is getting worse. Several recently released reports, among them one from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, show that homicide rates and the level of violence have decreased substantially in large parts of the world during the last 2 decades. This trend of declining crime rate has taken place throughout the 20th century and is especially clear in the last 30 years. Here to discuss tonight's last topic, global crime is declining, but have we created a safer world, are Jerzy Sarnecki, professor in criminology at Stockholm University, welcome.
Thank you.
Vania Ceccato, associate professor with a focus on urban safety at CEFIN, that is the School of Architecture and the Built Environment at KTH, welcome.
Thank you.
And Mas Dam, professor in Teleinformatics, theoretical computer science here at KTH, welcome.
Thank you.
Give our guests a warm round of applause. So good of you to join us. Jerzy Sarnecki, can you describe in broad strokes the development of crime rates in the 20th century?
Yeah, what you could say that during last 30 years we have this decrease of what would you call traditional crimes, which means thefts and violent crimes. And this is decrease which you could say is mostly related to the Western world. Most famous and well-known is United States, and maybe even New York, which has very, very substantial decrease of serious criminality. But we have this kind of development also in Scandinavia and also in several West European countries. And this is a great surprise because for 20, 30 years ago, no one would predict that this kind of crimes would go down. So this is a surprise, and I must say that we don't exactly know what it depends on. It's a very fascinating period of time now.
Vania Ceccato, you focused on how the design of cities affects the level of crime. Are cities in general becoming safer?
Well, I think regardless if crime is going up or going down, there are places in the city that are constantly attracting crime. They are dangerous. And basically, we would think like a city center. If you can take any city in the world, normally city centers are places that have quite a number of concentration of crime and disorder, and just because of the activities they have and the people they attract. Of course, if you think about safety as a synonym of basically crime, we would have some parts of the city that normally have more crime than others. I mean, if you don't think about city centers, right? And one way to try to understand that is that there are certain neighborhoods that have a composition, a demographic, socioeconomic composition that breeds crime. Normally, they are so-called social disorganized communities, and it's a place where formal and informal social control is difficult, and normally pockets of crime will happen there. But there are other ways also of looking at it. We can think about crime as a much more dynamic phenomena, and then crime will be a result of how people move around in the city. And of course, areas where you have a high concentration of people would tend to have more crime. But in order for crime to happen, happen and for you to have a concentration of crime, a dangerous place, you have to have basically an overlap of a potential victim of a target, basically a motivated offender, and no one seeing what's happening.
A victim, just to put in, victim, a motivated offender, and the opportunity, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lack
No,
of the control, I would
yeah,
say.
lack of control, lack
yeah.
of what normally you call guardianship. No one is seeing, or they are unable to intervene if something happens. But of course, this has to do with crime, and sometimes certain places in the city may have loads of crime, like city centers, and people still think that it's a safe place. Just because people have lots of people around.
I see. So the experience of safety is quite separated from the actual,
Absolutely.
fact. That's right. Mass, you've focused on IT security. Could you describe what your main research focus is?
Yes, I can. So I work on IT security. So we're talking cybercrime, and if there's a declining tendency in the crime rate at the moment, I'm afraid that cybercrime is probably the exception to this rule, which is sad. And many of the reasons, I'm a technical person. I work on technical operating systems kind of issues, and if we look at some of the technical causes for this phenomena, it is that the way we build our systems is mainly to support security and to provide as many bells and whistles as possible. So this is what we're seeing in modern, we see new versions of operating systems coming out, every half year, Android, iOS, and so I'm focusing a little bit on the mobile scene here because that's the scene which at the moment is seeing a huge growth. So what we are trying to do is to see if we can somehow re-engineer the situation to provide more security at the basic level. And
Vania just told us that the crime happens where you have a combination of a victim, a motivated offender, and the lack of guardianship. Would you say that is also true for cybercrime?
I think that sounds very much true, actually. That's right. That's right. So in the way we build systems, there's lots of opportunities because we build large, huge, very, very complicated hardware, huge, very, very complicated software that plays together in ways that are not fully understood. So there are problems, there are bugs, and there are security holes, and these holes are there to be exploited for those that are interested in. And since more and more resources are, exists in cyberspace, let's call it that. This is an arena which is interesting to be abused, and there's a lot more and more banking applications, more and more financial transactions, industry control, possibilities for blackmail. There's all sorts of possibilities. So what we're doing in our research is at the very low level of the operating system to see if we can provide some dramatic more
So a metaphor
security.
perhaps could be that if an operating system is a city, you're looking at urban planning solutions to crime rather than actual policing.
We're not, but that is also an activity that needs to be
Very
done.
good.
For sure.
Joining us via Skype from Berkeley is from Berkeley, California. Hello, is Professor Franklin Ziímring, Professor of Law at the Berkeley School of Law, also author of the book "The City That Became Safe: New York's Lessons for Urban Crime and Its Control." Welcome to Crosstalks.
Well, thank you.
You describe in your book this astounding decline in crime that the city of New York has experienced in the last 2 decades. Could you tell us a little bit about the book and about your main conclusions?
Surely. The United States in the 1990s experienced about a 40% drop in crime. And I concur with the professor of criminology at Stockholm, who said that an awful lot of the explanation for that 40% drop in crime is still a mystery. But New York City has had a crime decline that is twice as long. It's been going on now for 20 years and is twice as large. And what that means is that we have a city with the same population profile, the same physical surroundings, the same economic organization, and more than 80% of the peak rate of homicide has disappeared. 86% of robberies, 86% of burglaries, and 94% of the auto theft
But this is astonishing.
the city experienced in 1990 have gone away.
But I'm dumbfounded by these numbers. I knew it was a big difference, but this is very. I mean, this is huge. Do you have? Would you care to speculate on how this came about?
Well, you don't write a book unless you care to speculate. In a funny sense, I wanted to divide the crime drop in New York into two parts and speculate about only the second part. Just as I can't explain the 40% drop cyclically in crime in the rest of the United States, that 40% drop happened in New York as well. And if I can't explain it in Chicago or Los Angeles, I can't explain it in New York either. But the New York difference, that is to say, what was there that happened in New York City that didn't happen in other cities that might explain what pushed that city so far over the top? That we can explain, because the only thing that sets New York City apart from the rest of the United States was the tremendous increase in municipal police,
That's
the
interesting.
change in their strategies, and also the degree of their aggressiveness. So the part of New York's decline that put it in world record territory is probably policing. But there's a problem with that, because the received wisdom 20 years ago was that police wouldn't affect crime rates much, for a very simple reason. If you send the police to 125th and Lenox Avenue,
I'm sorry, your sound is breaking up. Can we just have that again? If you send the police
to 125th and Lenox Avenue, you might prevent a robbery there on Tuesday night. But what we used to think is that the robbers can simply go 15 blocks over to 140th Street, or they can wait until Tuesday. And under those circumstances, since we have such limited police concentration, the truly dedicated offender can't be deterred. Well,
Thank you.
what we found out is that if you send police to that one block where a robbery was going to happen, even though they can't be everywhere, that's one less robbery in New York City.
That's right.
To use the fancy label, crime is much more situational and contingent than we had ever thought.
Thank you. Okay, municipal police. Jerzy, you were laughing. What were you reacting to?
Well, I agree with Professor Ziímring. I mean, what we know now, which we didn't know before, is that we have, well, what we did know, it was that we have a concentration of crime to very, very small places, so-called hotspots. But what was generally believed that when you use the police force at these places, the crime will be disappear to other places, close to the place or far away in the place. And the research showed by, among others, Professor David Weisbot, who is the winner of the Stockholm Prize of Criminology, that that the criminals would stay at the same place. So if you prevent crime at this very special hotspot, it will be less crime there and even less crime around the place. And this is, of course, a very good explanation why police could be very much effective in these cases.
So would I be, okay, now I'm just gonna, maybe I am childish here, but now we just heard previously that certain types of places are likely to attract crime. These are the types of places that become hotspots. So if you police the kinds of urban areas where crime is more prevalent, that can have systemic effects, so to say.
Yes, well, what you would have to do is, of course, to use your police resources in the proper way, which is not always the case. I mean, if police would just randomly patrol all the city, you wouldn't get this kind of effect. But if you concentrate the police to very particular places, then you win probably substantial decrease of crime.
Vania, what would you like to add?
Yes, I agree. If we just distribute the police everywhere, we will be chasing ghosts, right? And probably it will be a waste of resources. But I wonder also if there are other possibilities of thinking about how crime can actually go down. I mean, New York has had a decrease. I agree that there is quite a lot of to do with the work of the police, but I also understand that there are other cities that may have not been had the same types of police programs and also end up having a decrease on crime. So there are possible other explanations that would underline this process that is probably also important to highlight.
That would be the other 40% then, the other 40% drop. Does anybody have a theory?
Well, yes, of course. Theories is very easy to have. The problem is to prove them. But in general, I mean, the explanation of the general changes in crime could be attributed to two factors: social control and the structure of opportunities. And the question of this enormous decrease of car thefts, which is not only in New York, but it's all over the world, also in Sweden, is very much dependent that cars are constructed different way. They are much harder to steal. So this is structure of opportunities. But on the other hand, very many different factors in structure of opportunities were increasing during this period, and crime was still decreasing, which, according to my theoretical view, must depend on increase of the social control. We are much more controlling each other, not least through the sources Mats is controlling.
That's right. And of course, this, yes, Franklin.
Yeah, I want to put a fine point on what we mean by social control, because the thing that was amazing about New York is that while the incarceration rate for the rest of the United States went up 65% over the 2 decades after 1990, New York's incarceration rate went down 29%. So that in essence, what we used to think that was that offenders were so persistent that incapacitation was the only mechanism of effective crime control. And what we found out is that much more situational changes at almost superficial level were more effective, not just as effective as prison, but more effective. Now, for an American, what that meant is that New York was demonstrating that our investments in crime control over the past generation had been going in all the wrong places.
That's right, because just to mention, if somebody is not aware of this, that America, of course, has a huge prison population. The overall trend has been to try to incapacitate criminals by taking them off the streets, as the saying goes. Yeah.
United States has more than 10 times more prisoners per 100,000 citizens compared to Sweden.
Mass.
So as an IT...
But
Just a moment.
even more important, most of that difference opened up over the last generation and a half. The American incarceration rate increased sevenfold. The rate per 100,000 citizens increased fourfold.
That's right.
And it was the only thing we were investing in because we had a theory of criminals who were so persistent that nothing else could work. And what New York has proved is that that was dead wrong.
And what is wonderful about this, and another thing, which is, I mean, it's of course very sad that all of these resources have been invested in such a flawed way. But this shows that the research is so incredibly valuable, because of course now we know this. Now, of course, it's also a question of convincing decision makers. Mass.
Yeah, so as an IT person, I can't help but pose a question here, because if we think of in terms of computers and stuff, a huge difference between now and 30 years ago is that most 17-year-old youngsters are sitting in front of their computers or with a mobile phone playing games. Yes. So they're not around on the streets knocking people on the head or whatever.
I think you are absolutely right. I mean, this is one of the structural changes which are happening. I mean, it's more into that. I mean, they are not running around and hitting people in the head, and they even don't steal the CD records in the CD record shops because there are no CD record shops. So what they steal is the CD records on the internet. Yeah. So of course, it's a huge change,
but,
and it's very important.
The reason we're quite sure that isn't all that's going on is that the crime rates of repeat offenders, the people who are released from prison, have also gone way down. Mm. And they live in the hotspot neighborhoods, which are not penetrated by smartphones. They may be playing fantasy football, but at much lower rates. And their personal crime rates are down by 2/3.
Professor Ziímring, we know that you have to leave us in a little while, so I'd just like to ask you one last question. Do you have, based on your research, any advice for, let's say, the decision makers here in Stockholm on how to bring down our crime rates?
Absolutely. What we've learned in New York City is that going to where the crime is located and making superficial changes in environments, putting cameras in, putting police around, creating parole supervision that is somewhat more effective. All of the techniques that assume that people can change seem to work much better than we ever thought. And all of the programs that are founded on the notion that serious and repeat criminals can't be changed turn out to be economically and philosophically erroneous.
This is wonderful news. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor Franklin Ziímring. Thank you. I do have to tag on to this, the question of security cameras. I mean, all in your different fields, you would have, I think, different views on this. How do you feel about, let's say, CCTVs in the urban landscape as a deterrent against crime? Who would like to start? Vania.
Well, I think there have been quite a lot of research on this area, and a recent study that actually combined evidence both from property and violent crimes shows that it has a marginal effect on property crime, but not on violence. So I'm not that convinced that the solution is only that. I think that is a combination of things, but I'm not over convinced that that is the solution. One of the things that is important to say is that in the case of New York, for instance, although crime rates are going down, the rate of report of crime is going up, which actually corroborate with the idea that social control is increasing. And social control is increasing not only in terms of CCTV cameras being put in place, but also people are much more attentive, using mobile phones to take photos of if anything happens. So I think that the key thing is social control and how to trigger basically mechanisms that generate social control, both formally and informal social control.
Social control sounds like such an incredibly negative term to me, but what we're saying also that it's a cultural change towards maybe more civic responsibility. That would be a good thing, a good kind of social control. Yes.
This is, I think, very important thing, because we were talking about the social control in the formal terms. I mean, the more police officers, more cameras, this kind of stuff. And of course, it works to some extent. But I believe that the most important change in this country, for instance, is not the increase of the formal control, which is also going on, but the increase of informal social control. If you look at the changes between how do we treat our kids 25 years ago and now, it's enormous change. I mean, children are much more controlled. People are much more aware what happened around them, and people are much more reporting, exactly as Vania is saying, to the police, different kind of things which wouldn't be reported. I mean, one of the areas where we have tremendous increase of reports is in the relation to the sexual crimes. Mm-hmm. Things which wouldn't be reported 20 years ago, 30 years ago, people would be ashamed to report them, are reported now. And this is also case in many other areas. Back to the CCTV, which is important discussion. I agree with Vania. According to the research we have at place, the only very much effective kind of CCTV control is in the garages, in the parking lots. Mm-hmm. This is it works, and it's proved by the research. Otherwise, we have no this kind of results according to stop people of committing crimes. What we have the results is in relation to apprehension level. Because
catching them.
Catching people, yes. Mm. Yes, what happens is that afterwards, people would be accused for the crimes if the crimes are at the film. Mm. So this is a change. But this is still very much to do in evaluation of CCTV. I think we will get much more information about it because we don't know enough.
So maybe not prevention, but possibly solving crimes becomes easier.
Which is partly also prevention.
Yes, that's right. Yes, Mads, how do you feel about this?
Surveillance in cyberspace surveillance is a very, very complex issue, and it has so many aspects to it. You know, in what is one person's channel to freedom and expression and opposition, and getting information out in the open space is another person's network for spreading pedophile material, and how to strike the balance between those types of surveillance or not surveillance, openness or closeness. That is completely, as far as I can see, in the open at the moment. We don't have any any stability in this at all. At the moment, it is free for all. Huh?
I mean, of course, we've had cities for thousands of years, but the modern kind of city grew out of industrialization when we started building factories, and big working populations came from the country to moved into the cities to work, and a lot of existing social structures were broken down, perhaps, and new ones. It took some time for new ones to be established. And I'm thinking now, perhaps the internet or this whole virtual, all of these virtual systems, of which the internet is one, maybe that is a little bit like the 19th century city, that we have all of these slums and not a lot of social structure and not a lot of a communal culture of how to behave. And maybe it's taken us over 100 years to figure out how to behave in cities. Is this a valid metaphor? It just struck me now. I'm just thinking out loud.
I think you're right. And I think, well, to some extent, I mean, what was happening in the cities and all over the very big parts of the world was increase of the freedom from the control. In the small cities 200-300 years ago, everyone knew everyone. All people were going to church on Sunday and were talking about what other people were doing between this Sunday and the next Sunday. And the kids couldn't do anything because they were extremely controlled, because everyone knew whose kids they were and so on. Since that, the changes were quite a lot of giving us more freedom, giving us more individuality, sort of. I mean, people didn't know that much about us. The privacy was increased. But I think changes in very many different ways, among others in the cyberspace, is introducing back this kind of very, very careful control about what we are doing, what we are saying, and who we are. Oh. I mean, the Facebook is, in a matter of fact, more or less the same as the people did after the church services at Sundays.
Okay, so now we've established that in some ways, cities, the virtual world is more like cities, and in some ways it's like a very small village, so the control is increasing while anonymity is also, and these things are happening at the same time, just at different levels.
So. We are becoming provincial to some extent within the communities that we share information.
Yeah, I'm not so sure I agree. There's too many aspects to this, right? there's the whole NSA story of surveillance, which, yeah.
I think you're right. This is much more complicated.
Yeah, it's much more complicated than that. Yeah.
To some extent, but because you can't be anonymous at the internet, and people who are anonymous are normally not. Well, they behave pretty nasty from time to time, which is the culture of the internet, pretty much. Yeah. But at the same time, I mean, I can again tell all the people who are interested what I had for breakfast today, which is a kind of the introduction of the old kinds of social controls through the new media.
But you are allowing that. You could also choose not to Instagram your breakfast or whatever it is.
I'm not
what these professors do these days,
You could choose to be completely transparent, completely anonymous, and only talk to your community of people, and nobody else will discover that you are around. So.
Well, I have to add one thing, because this is not only a question of what you're informing other people about. Because in this country, for instance, which is a welfare country, we have enormous number of different kind of registers kept by the authorities. And these registers are having enormous amount of information about you, which you are not controlling. And probably in the welfare society of the kind we have in Sweden, these registers are necessary, but they are also restricting your privacy, of course.
But they are not available to everybody. They are just available to a huge number of people who work in the relevant sectors.
Sufficiently many to control you, for instance, according to your criminal activity.
Okay, but let's say with all of your completely different academic interests, how do you rate? I mean, I know this is a huge question, but what is your take on, for instance, these issues of global surveillance, but also sort of local surveillance? do you have any ideological tools to help me, for instance, value? Should I give up some of my integrity to get some safety? Is that a fair trade, like our governments are saying, Mass?
It's a normative question, which is, I mean, what you want to do, you want to do. On the aggregate level in the internet, I think there is a huge potential for consensus about more surveillance. Yes, that would be my feeling. You know, but this is not as a technical person. I'm saying this just as a private person. You know, there are so many phenomena around and so many dangers that young kids are exposed to at the end of the day. That people are probably willing, on balance, to sacrifice quite a lot of privacy and quite a lot of control, provided that it is done in a way which is they can see that abuse will.
Which feels
systematic
okay.
Abuse will be discovered. There's room for Edward Snowden's to, reveal abuses, and if we are seeing these kinds of, these
so if we can
public
establish
reports,
some checks and balances,
then
probably yes. Vania.
I think one part of the insecurity we face is basically that we don't have institutions that perhaps regulate this amount of information and how these resources are actually put in front of us, and I think it's still then comes the question: which level we would need to have this censorship, and of course, then we end up with very important ethical and moral questions. I think that it's not an easy question, and I mean, just take an example. Women feel quite unsafe of having CCTV cameras on, for instance, underground stations, even though they would think that that is something good for them. So, how can we balance that? I don't think that there is a single answer.
Jerzy. I mean, it's a bit special for Sweden, where we have this belief of the good governments. I mean, the authorities are nice to us. They are not committing that many crimes against the population, etc. So I think that there is a bigger risk in Sweden than in other countries that the very high degree of surveillance will be accepted, and is accepted, by the way. Now, I mean, we have a very little discussion of the privacy. In other countries, I think it will be much more complicated. I mean, people in England, for not mentioning people in the United States, are much more sort of aware of that authorities might be misusing the information about them. But in general, what we have here is a huge fear of crime. And we can talk to people and tell them crime, traditional crime, is decreasing. People are still very much afraid of crime. And since they are afraid of crime, they are accepting different kinds of intrusions in their privacy. And this is a problem.
Vania, you've spoken about something you call bubbles of security. What is that?
Well, it is somehow more related to cities of the global south. Probably we could have the same analogy here in Western big European cities, but I think it's much more visible in areas where rates of violence has reached high proportions, like cities like São Paulo, Rio, or South African cities. What I mean by that is that in countries like in Brazil, you end up, security concerns has made people to buy security. Security has become a commodity, and by that I mean that basically there is a big industry that provide in a number of prices, labels, this kind of a peace of mind. It can be, for instance, you can live in a gated community and you may buy a Hummer and go to a hermetic shopping mall, and from there you go to
a sealed mall.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean by bubbles of security, that all social interaction end up happening in these bubbles of security, from gated communities to private security, hermetic shopping malls or private schools or leisure. And of course, then you would think, what is the meaning of the city if you end up having a big limitation in terms of social interaction? Even crime is going to happen in a very different way if we end up moving in that way, right? Because
right.
the routine activity of the people would be limited by that, at least by those that actually can afford to live in a gated community, to buy a Hummer, to go to a shopping center. So as any other type of commodity, security become only for those who can pay.
And this is perhaps reconnecting us to our headline question. So yes, crime rates are declining, but in much more in the global north, much more in industrialized nations. So have we created a safer world? Then the answer is yes for some people.
Yes.
And that becomes incredibly clear in this. This state of affairs also becomes a metaphor, perhaps, for an overall global process.
Well, I have to say that even in cities like Rio and São Paulo, we had a decrease of homicide rates in the 2 decades. Now it's going up again, and but the important thing is that it has, at least in the Brazilian context, it hasn't much to do with policing. And there are what is important to discuss here is that there are processes that are going on that are contextual dependent, and that this is very, very important before we draw general conclusions.
Context dependent
then you
things.
have to remember that the people
Briefly.
who are living in these gated communities and are extremely safe, etc., they still are committing a lot of different kind of crimes, like crimes against economy, crimes against the environment, war crimes, and all other crimes. So a crime is much bigger subject
and domestic
than only,
violence and all of
and,
the
and maybe
that's
domestic
right,
violence
that's right.
and maybe other things. Well, I mean, this is one of our problems, that when we talk crime, we are mostly speaking about this petty crimes of stealing and beating, etc.,
Right.
and not talking about the huge crimes which are committed by powerful people.
Do we have a question from the audience? Oh, many. There's one in the back. Yes, please. Yes, sir.
My name is Mina. I'm studying at KTH. I'm from Egypt, and I have a couple of questions. I'll try to make it short. First, you said that anonymous people usually do, illegal things. While I don't see the point here, because we have a lot of countries where anonymous people are just trying to defend human rights, women's rights,
That's right.
political activists, etc., and they must be anonymous or else they're going to be tortured to death. We need to mention that the majority of human beings, they don't live in developed countries. When we say that the global crime rate is decreasing, that pretty much means nothing. We're taking the US as an example, and it has the highest prisoners rate in the world. So that means there is a huge problem. Going it up or down a bit, it won't change anything.
I'd like to add, just a moment, I'd like to add here then, because these, of course, are governments that should be considered criminal, I think, the dictatorial governments, so their crimes are rarely measured in these kinds of conversations. That's right. Yes, your other question, please.
That is great, but with the statistics, I mean, when we see that Central African republics or a lot of countries in Africa measuring way better than Switzerland or the States or anybody in terms of prisoners, that makes no sense when we see genocides and car bombings every day.
Right.
Suicide rates are not being counted. A lot of crimes are not being registered. You have no actual statistics for the majority of human beings. So we cannot claim that the global rate is, we can talk about statistics in developed countries because they are registered, but on the planet, it doesn't make any sense.
Yes, you're right. Let's also let the panel
To
respond.
some extent,
Jerzy.
yes, and I would say that, of course, we were talking about decline of crime in the Western world.
There's
So this
no
is
of
exactly
course, but yeah,
so this is what we
implicitly
are talking.
were.
No,
Yes.
this is what we are talking about. And the second point is that the problem is definition of crime. I mean, crime is by the law punishable acts. And the freedom fighters and the people who are claiming rights to voting and democracy and so on may be counted as criminals in country where legislation is prohibiting this kind of acts. So this is so it's even more complicated than that.
Yes, Mass, just a moment. Yeah, Mass.
As far as the other question is concerned, the role of anonymity, I totally agree. I think there is. It's back to this double-edged sword of surveillance. Sometimes it's, can be a force of good and security, and in some cases it can be a source of surveillance in order to keep your population in check. Anonymity is exactly the same.
Vania.
Well, you were saying that statistics may be not very important. I have to disagree with that. I think although they are not perfect, they are basically the tools that we have to go forward. I mean, to use as a basis for policy, and that's the best we can. Even in developing countries, even if they are not perfect, they are, the basis for everything we do. So it has a point of collecting data and put together. Otherwise, it is better that you just try to have a crystal ball and think about the future.
Yeah. Very, very briefly.
Sure. It's just that with the whole anonymity and surveillance thing, for example, in Sweden, there is a trust in police, for example, which is not the case in a lot of other countries.
That's right.
Here in Europe, there is like the ban or the blocking on child pornography. I see it more as laziness from the police and from countries. Instead of going after those people with child trafficking, etc., they're just blocking information. It's about the concept more than anything. When we're talking about a global issue, the internet was made to be free and open for everybody, for information flow. When we block some websites and give the citizens the idea that, this thing does not exist, no, it does exist, but we're lazy to go and fight it out of the country.
Thank you.
But we're just blocking it.
Thank you. Jerzy, and just then another question.
One, now, I don't agree with this statement because we can't go for people in the other parts of the world who are producing child pornography and so on. So it's a blocking structure of opportunities we are preventing to some extent, not very much, but still crimes. The second point is, and this is important, I think, when you are talking about the anonymity, we are not talking only about the anonymity towards the authorities. We are talking about much more general anonymity. All people are related to other people, and this is a main source of the social control. It's this informal social control. People among friends, among families, and others. And this part of social control is much more important than the formal part.
And I completely agree with the criticism of equating the global north with the world, which is ridiculous, of course. There is the example of child pornography is one where the possibility of online surveillance and international collaborations in crime fighting has had some astonishing results recently. So we're also going for the physical criminals, as we should. Yes, please. Sorry. Yes.
My name is Ankita, and my question is quite specific about the crime, violence against women in poor or developing countries like maybe south part of Asia or Africa. So what do you think the main reason is? Is it poverty or the population or like corruption or lack of social control or whatever? Because I come from India and I see a lot of violence against women there. That's why.
Thank you for your question. That's a very good question. What do you think about the main reasons?
I think that violence against women is not only focused on, it's spreading in all stratus of society, which can be found even here in Sweden, in rural areas or urban areas. So there are people are coming forward and reporting, for instance, more domestic violence here in Sweden, because there is awareness and an infrastructure for women to come forward that in the past didn't exist. For instance, until 1965, for instance, rape in marital condition would be here in Sweden considered as not as a crime. Just after 65, that was basically declared as a crime. So I think what has to change is how the conception of gender and the basics of the infrastructure for women to come forward, to have, for instance, police organizations that can take, for instance, victims of violence, domestic violence or rape, much more seriously. There is absolutely no point to go to a police station when men will be laughing at you if you say that you are raped, right?
So what I'm hearing is that you're saying that violence against women is endemic everywhere. So it's essentially a function of normative gender roles in a patriarchal society, no matter where you are in the world.
That's right.
Jerzy, do you agree that the reasons are similar regardless of where you are in the world?
I think you mentioned many factors which are important for violence against women, and I would certainly agree that lack of equality is one of the most important factors.
Lack of equality.
Yes, but I also believe that poverty and lack of education and lack of opportunities and so on is also related. I mean, we have many cases of violence against women in the Western world, but we have more cases of that kind, for instance, in India. So poverty is one important factor here too, as in many other cases.
You know what? This is all we have time for tonight. I'd really like to stop at something hopeful. Do you think, if you look into the future, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, will the world be safer for everybody, or will it get a lot worse?
I think it would be unwise to make very too many predictions, because it depends. I mean, we have at the moment positive trend, decreasing crime trends in the Western world. But what will happen, for instance, in the global change of the climate change would continue?
And additional migration and poverty that seems, and social unrest that would seem very likely to follow, yes.
Exactly. So we are so dependent of so many variables which we don't control.
Vania?
Yes, I agree. I think that there are lots of other anxieties on everyday life that feed this feeling that perhaps we call fear of crime, but actually are other things that we can't really put our thing on. But I also think that we have to be optimistic, and at least at the city level, you have to think about ways on how you can make people safer. And one I think that is crucial is to think about safety as an individual right, regardless what you are, resources you have, gender, age, and so on.
Yeah. Mas?
Yeah. I want to end on an optimistic note. Yes, I think in 20 years from now, we will live in a safer world. Wealth has increased after all. Poverty has decreased a lot. Poverty is an important source of crime and problems. We'll probably continue on that road. As far as cybercrime is concerned, we're in a transition phase. It's not going to, we are not going to be in the same situation 20 years from now. We'll be able to develop much better technology, which plugs some of the holes that are available these days. and we'll learn to manage the social interactions on the net much better than we are now. We'll simply learn how to live with it and integrate with it, and
That is
so
hopeful.
that'll cause crime to decrease, I think.
And that is all we had time for this evening. Thanks to all our guests, Vania, Ceccato, Jerzy, Sarnecki, and Masdam, and of course Franklin Ziímring from before. A very warm thank you also to our audience here at KTH, and not least you viewers around the world. Crosstalks will be back in February with 3 brand new topics. Until then, be safe and be brave.